I'm presenting from the first chapter of our book collection that we've just submitted, Digital Internet Publics and Social Media, and that's with Nicholas Carra and Brady Robards. So the first chapter of that is where we try and do the theoretical work of, so it's called Towards Theorising Public Lives on Private Platforms. And I want to acknowledge the work, the ideas in here, in particular Brady and Nick, but in particular Nick and I have been sort of developing a lot of these ideas together over the past several years really in conversations. So I'm going to talk through today before I go further, I'll also give a quick plug to the conference that Tama and I are convening that will be here at the end of the year, which is where we'll hopefully launch this book, Digital Intimacies for Porousness and Permutations. You can find out more about that on the Tumblr site. And we're really excited about the keynotes who are coming over, Professor Jessica Ringrose from the Institute of Education in London, and we can now announce Shaka McLaughlin as well, who's coming over from Cunningham, New York, I think, some school within the New York University. So should be good. Get your abstracts in if you're interested and check it out. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is take you through some of the queer theory, mostly from Lauren Ballant, that I'm drawing on to kind of try and theorise digital intimate publics. And what I think this frame does, in short, is help us more deeply comprehend how contestations of power play out in social media spaces where the public and private intermingle, and what is actually at stake in public recent discourses and debates, as well as our own psychic musings about oversharing, social media excesses and transgressions. And I'm of course realising that privacy debates are a huge part of this as well, although it didn't hit me until this morning. So then I'm going to walk through how and why it is that digital intimacies and their value is understood quite differently from different scholarly sort of traditions or disciplines. And this is, a generalisation that we hope serves a sort of a purpose of trying to map the way that in cultural and social media, cultural and social studies of social media and people's practices, digital intimacies can often be kind of conceived of more in terms of social capital, whereas in critical media and political economy studies, digital intimacies are primarily conceived of as labour, as a kind of labour. So what we're trying to suggest is that both of these perspectives provide, really important critical insights into the politics of digital intimate publics and help us argue towards a politics of publicness in terms of both identities and property. So that's kind of what I'm going to try and get through today. So we usually think about intimacy as to do with our private personal lives, as describing feelings and relationships that are most inward to one's personhood, as McLaughlin puts it, and concerned with relationships that are most important to us. So intimacy, in a sense, is really about, in some ways, the hierarchicalisation of relationships, I'm trying to say. But as queer theory and sexuality studies tells us, intimacy is very much socially sanctioned, defined by institutions, laws, and normative social pressures. Queer and feminist critical cultural theorists like Lauren Ballant have argued that in late modern cultures, having a life has become equated with having an intimate life. And I'm going to be drawing also on Eva Alous, who's a feminist sociologist who argues something sort of similar. As Kafai and Couldry note, what queer theory has taught us is that heteronormativity shapes what can appear to us as intimate, even in settings where questions of sexual identity are typically not articulated as such. And this is really what I'm trying to get at in drawing on queer theory in relation to digital intimacies, is the way that heteronormativity structures our very notions of what is intimate and what is not. An intimate public operates, Ballant suggests, when a market opens up to a block of consumers claiming to circulate texts and things that express those people's particular core interests and desires. So intimate publics create shared worldviews and shared emotional knowledge. They are, quote, a space of mediation in which the personal is refracted through the general. And another quote, an intimate public, Ballant says, flourishes as a porous, effective scene of identification among strangers that promises a certain experience of belonging and provides a complex of consolation, confirmation, discipline and discussion about how to live as a ... an X, a man, a woman, a transgender person. Intimate publics can be understood in some as scenes that are centred around media and culture of the commodification of intimacy, of self and of political identities, as scenes of pedagogical discipline about normativity and normative intimate desires for different groups of subjects, as well as cultural scenes that promise and generate feelings of belonging and consolation. So such scenes now play out vividly across social media, as the research of several of us here illustrates well, and as all of the chapters in our book, as most of the chapters in our book vividly illustrate too. Social media, as Hjorth and Arnold argue, constitute a new socio-technical institutionalisation of public intimacy. My area is, I'm just trying to see if I'm actually up to the right slide. Oh well, I'll get back on track somewhere if I'm not. It's not that dependent on the slides anyway. So my area is more specifically in digital sexual cultures, and some scholars in that area have suggested that new modes of intimacy and new visual sexual practices are emerging due to a confluence of social, historical, material and design actants. What I'm more interested in thinking through here is the more mundane, less spectacular ways the social and cultural meaning of intimacy is currently being contested and struggled over via debates about and use of social media. Debates about social media frequently air concerns about the excessive publicisation of intimate relations and experiences. So these kind of questions, are people oversharing, and what do we mean by that? We mean providing an excess of information deemed too personal, too private, or speaking too much, too publicly, too frequently about things like the routines of everyday lives, sharing too much data, too many images documenting various aspects of life, often, like I said, deemed kind of pedestrian, mundane, crass, or even unethical. For example, food, babies, pets and selfies are all prominently kind of themes and topics that are in contestation for a very complex range of reasons, which I'm going to flatten out and suggest that these concerns do, however, too often I think, revolve around a moralisation of certain excesses and the potential disruptions of intimacy caused by such excesses. So particularly, particularly contested areas might be, as I mentioned, excessive kind of images of the routine, mundane parts of our everyday lives. The excessive selfies produced by girls and young women has been an area that I've been particularly interested in, and micro-celebrities and influencers seeking attention. And of course the accessibility of excessive amounts of images related to sex and bodies. In relation to such concerns, we must, I think, keep in mind that public self-telling and display are coded as excessive and pathological for some bodies while celebrated for others, in ways that are deeply structured by gender, class, race, sexuality and other embodied factors. And Beverly Skeggs' work makes this point really nicely, and her book with Helen Wood, Reacting to Reality Television, is sort of the idea that I'm going to there, even though it's about reality television, not social media. So the theoretical frame of intimate publics helps us think about how, like I said, contestations over power play out in the generative liminal space where the public and private intermingle. Ballant and Warner, in their 1998 essay Sex in Public, advocate for a publicisation of the intimate that speaks against privatisation in the sense of both space and property, with the deep appreciation of the connection between the prioritisation of private property rights and private heteronormative spaces and familial relations. In their account, the politics of intimacy in public, beyond seeking safety and acceptance of a range of sexual and gender practices and identities, is about, quote, the changed possibilities of identity, intelligibility, publics, cultures, and sex that appear when the heterosexual couple is no longer the referent or the privileged example of a sexual culture. They advocate then for a publicisation of not just sex but other significant forms of care, love and intimacy, with a view to imagining attachments and relations beyond the domain of private heterosexual family life and even beyond communities as such, towards they're provoking us to think about how can we imagine ourselves as broader publics and counter-publics with capacities for less bounded forms of care and intimate pleasure. Intimate care and pleasure, I should say. So again, on social media platforms, communication and representational practices related to so many different aspects of life, politics, civic action, work and labour, creativity, belonging, relationships and with our family and with a whole range of different peoples, intermingle and even co-constitute each other. The tensions between public and private produced by communicating in a digital space of collapsed, flattened social contexts, as Marwick and Boyd have suggested, are dynamic and complex and ambivalent in terms of the risks and opportunities engendered for individuals, especially along lines of gender and sexual identity, race and class. Nonetheless, you know, the way people use social media is making it kind of increasingly difficult to sustain the illusory separation of politics from intimate life, the illusory separation of both chosen and unchosen identities from politics, and the illusion of the private heteronormative family as the ideal or primary source of intimacy, care and pleasure, rather than broader communities and publics possibly as such. Beyond the visual display of social connections, being able to trace words of care and support that people share with each other, read about people's crises, challenges at work, with family, with loved ones, unforeseen health problems and accidents, as well as seeing when and how certain identities, images, words or interactions result in conflicts and abuse, raise a potentially important challenge, I'm suggesting, if we recognise it as such, to the heteropatriarchal framework of privatised intimacy, boxed and bounded within families, that Ballant and Warner are problematising. So Ballant also calls for a consideration of less organised, more mobile processes of attachment in imagining forms of intimacy outside normative relational forms and beyond the purview of institutions, states and nations. More recently, and specifically in relation to digital cultures, Larson and Hjorth note the political importance of what they suggest are shifts in the regime of attention, in what is perceived, noted and effectively witnessed. I think what they're trying to ask about is the power dynamics thrown into question through the kind of everyday, mundane, excessive and intimate digital inscriptions made by and on social and mobile media, and the associated shifts in the regime of attention. So more mobile and organised forms of attachment, we can argue, do form on social media platforms, and again, these are illustrated in the collections in our chapter. And drawing on Ballant and Warner, we can better understand, I think, the generative political potential of attending to unpredictable intimacies on social media, those that extend beyond the boundaries of families and even beyond communities. And we can also then understand the need for an ethics of expanded care in socially collapsed contexts of interaction, particularly on platforms like Facebook. But crucially, we must hold on to the double sense of public as referring to both space and property ownership. So in the context of social media's digital intimate publics, that means critically examining the relationship between the political valence of public formations of many unpredictable kinds of intimacy on platforms that privatise, as in commercialise, and take ownership of that intimacy. Shaka McLaughlin argues that technophobic panics about the impact of new technologies on our lives have always turned on questions of intimacy. So these concerns are intensified by the ubiquity of smartphones, social media and hookup apps. Virtual intimacies, as they call them, are often publicly constructed as failed intimacies, quote, that disrupt the flow of a good life lived right, that is, a life that involves coupling and kids, or at least coupling and consumption. Other scholars of digital intimacies have observed similarly derisive cultural attitudes towards digital mediated and virtual forms of intimacy as potentially, quote, diminished and dangerous corruptions of the real thing. However, my point in relation to those positions is that intimacies via contemporary social media platforms need to be understood not only in relation to moral panics over the potential weakening of social life and intimate relations in the digital age, but in relation to the very commodification of relationships itself that is built into platform infrastructure. So privately owned platforms as places where heteronormativities and good lives are represented, circulated, constituted and sold back to us, as it kind of were, and as we explain more in the chapter. In short, digital intimate publics, like the intimate publics Ballant describes as constituted by other kinds of mass media address and representation, are complex and ambivalent in their aesthetics and politics, in short. So that's why we sort of argue towards excessive and ambivalent publicisation and excessive unambivalent privatisation as sort of characterising these spaces. So going on, the function and politics of digital intimacies are often understood quite differently via a common dichotomy of disciplinary concerns. And as I said, I'm kind of generalising in making this dichotomy. But social and cultural studies concerns often centre around people's digital media participation practices, habits and identities, while critical media and political economy centres on the political economy of data on social media platforms. So for scholars concerned primarily with the dynamics and nuances of people's participation, digital intimacies can be understood as constitutive of a kind of social capital that structures experiences and mobilisations of intimacy, identity and belonging. Whereas when people's sharing practices are viewed primarily in relation to the commercial business models of social media, intimate communication can be seen as a kind of free labour. So that is, the media practices involved in the doing of intimacy online double as the generation of valuable content, attention, social networks and data. And social media has been critically understood as machines that capture and channel the human capacity to affect one another. I want to briefly outline these perspectives a bit more, focusing on intimacy as capital, because that's the social capital, that's the bit that I'm more interested in, not so much intimacy as labour, which is more the bit that Nick Carra is interested in. And then go on to kind of try and make some suggestions about the kind of ethics and politics of publicness that we suggest flows from these perspectives. So what we highlight is the need to hold these perspectives together in order to help us think through the constitution of digital intimate publics as intertwined processes of human socialisation, subjectification, algorithmic sorting and machine learning. So talking through conceptualisations of digital intimacy and social capital, and I'm skipping over some stuff here to go straight to Eva Illouz, whose work I really like. So she reminds us that for a particular form of cultural behaviour to become a capital, it must be convertible into economic and social benefits. And social media connections, attachments and relations, of course, do not always convert directly into capital or social mobility. The point of sort of making this broader framework and conceptualising digital intimacies as in terms of social capital or as a potential kind of social capital, or rather, I should say, as key to its acquisition, is to highlight such media practices as valuable resources for people and as unevenly distributed ones. Intimacy can be seen as a resource tied to knowledge and power because, as feminists have long pointed out, we are not only rational thinkers and decision makers, but beings with significant social and emotional investments whose actions and biographies are informed and constituted by these investments. So Illouz suggests that one's emotional style, as she calls it, emotional attitude and emotional style, define one's social identity and is crucial to how people acquire networks and build social capital. She argues that over the course of the 20th century, in relation to the rise of therapeutic language and psychology, a particular kind of emotional style has become valued and valuable. She suggests that being able to narrate the self in ways that constitute it as transparent and as an authentic expression of internality has become a cultural precondition of forms of happiness and well-being. But key to her argument is that the therapeutic language that she kind of shows the social construction of this, the therapeutic language and the particular form of emotional habitus, as she calls it, that it's produced as culturally valued, is not merely a ploy to discipline subjects and pathologise those unable to conform. It's a resource that is good for addressing the volatile nature of selfhood and social relationships in late modernity. So I go to her because I think she helps us understand the social and material and psychological stakes of getting our emotional habitus right on social media and getting a transparent emotional habitus right in one's social context. And there's some really interesting echoings of this work emerging in studies around digital intimacy and influences and social capital, so which I want to go through a little bit next. So Alex Lambert's findings, and I'm sort of jumping all over a really long paper here, so apologies. But Alex Lambert's findings on how people learn to negotiate intimacy in digital spaces makes clear the complexity and nuance involved in negotiating emotional style and habitus via social media. So participants in his study were highly wary of the kind of unashamed public intimacy, attention-grabbing and overtly emotional confessions that have been the source of prominent discourses about the excesses of social media and the transgressions and the oversharing of social media. So public declarations of love for partners, close friends, sadness and longing for relatives living far away, these were things that were all given by his participants as examples of overly intimate sharing that he suggested alienated the Facebook users with whom he spoke. Sharing about Whereas on the other hand, they said sharing about daily consumption practices like meals was seen as mundanely personal rather than interpersonal, and thus not intimate enough. So there's this very fine line that these people were saying you have to walk in order to make me feel comfortable on Facebook. Lambert suggests that rewarding performances of connection on Facebook commonly occur through light-hearted, playful and gregarious emotional tones. So he proposes the concept of intimacy capital as a recognition that the cultural and socio-technical competencies required to negotiate intimacy and thus have both rewarding and safe exchanges on Facebook are not evenly distributed in society. And people negotiate intimacy on social media differently based on cultural and socio-economic background, levels of education and, of course, levels of digital literacy. The conversion of this transparent emotional style and intimate confessions on social media into capital is perhaps most obviously notable in relation to micro-celebrities and influencers. And recent research in this area, I think, is really interesting. Abaddon's work and the other people who I'll discuss, and Can I as well, because it makes clear that the intimate public revelations and performances need to be understood beyond simple dichotomies of strategic or instrumental intimacy on one hand and authentic, effective intimacy on the other hand. So Tobias Rawn, for instance, examines vlogger Julie Van Vu as a subcultural micro-celebrity who he suggests transgresses this dichotomy. Vu combines activism, effective connection and overt monetisation through product placements and sponsorships. And in filming her pubic hair laser removal along with breast augmentation surgery and other transgender surgical processes, Vu's content, quote, appears simultaneously as personal life storytelling, knowledge sharing and product placement. Ron suggests what matters is not whether the intimacy communicated is authentic or not, but rather how it works as a genre in the techno-cultural setting, creating and channeling expectations and attachments and channeling the affects of one's audience adeptly. Just one further example, Rachel Berryman and Misha Kavkar analysed crying vlogs and anxiety vlogs by well-known young female beauty vloggers on YouTube. So this is where young women cry themselves. Has anyone seen, film themselves like breaking down in tears on their kitchen floors usually. And these are very well-known. Who's the, Zoella? Is that the, yeah. Zoella's done a few of these. Or anxiety blogs where young women directly to camera talk about their bodily insecurities, even as these gorgeous beauty bloggers, and their psychological insecurities. So they suggest such videos have a lower advertising revenue potential within the economic structure of YouTube. However, crying and anxiety vlogs can function as a means of demonstrating vloggers' authenticity and thus fostering valuable intimacy between vloggers and their audience. But they suggest these vlogs also at the same time function as emotional outlets for the vloggers in visual social media cultures structured by a perceived compulsory emotional positivity and dominated by emotional tones of, they summarise the aspirational and the comic. And we can see also Marwick's work in this area, and Akane Kanai's book on micro-celebrities on Tumblr details this in relation to femininity really nicely. So these negative affect blogs, as they call them, along with some other research on micro-celebrity and other social research like Lambert's, and then we can also think of recent practices like Finstagram accounts that kind of speak to this perception of an overly prescriptive emotional habitus on social media platforms as required to mobilise and build social capital. the kind of positive, aspirational, chipper and playful but not overly emotionally effective style that Lambert and others have noted as facilitating rewarding interactions is commonly associated and more easily within reach of certain bodies with certain social histories over others. So what I'm trying to suggest through all of this, vaguely, if there is something, is that there's this classed, raced and gendered emotional habitus that's profoundly entwined with people's ability to belong and to acquire social capital that is being constituted, judged and evaluated and struggled over via public discourses as well as private psychic musings around oversharing, around privacy and excess and notions of excess, and the digital mediation of intimacies on social media. Drawing on Alou's and on the social and cultural research cited, we can begin to think about what it is that people navigate in order to develop a valuable emotional habitus in digital intimate publics. We can begin to imagine the kind of psychosocial and technical and emotional literacies that come into play when making subtle and fast and often less than conscious choices about intimate sharing in networked publics. So these are distinctions and choices about the kind of sharing, liking, tagging and commenting that humanises an individual and strengthens belonging with those among those with whom it's needed, desired and valuable. And the kind of intimate sharing and relationality that conversely provokes discomfort, disgust, boredom, annoyance, exclusion, rejection and pathologisation. And of course, socially marginalised bodies and groups have particular investments in working out or challenging these subtle distinctions between a valuable network building emotional habitus and a potentially sort of detrimental or pathologised one. But then when we start to, I guess, see the kinds of, well, let me just read what's here because I'm still working out these thoughts. In conceptualising digital intimacies in terms of social capital and its acquisition, the temptation is then to frame intimacy capital, as Lambert puts it, as the new good literacy that people of diverse backgrounds then need to somehow develop. So again, I'm wondering about the temptation here to sort of place the focus back onto individuals rather than social structures, the more we discover the kind of workings of social relations online and intimacy capital. Following queer and feminist theoretical trajectories, the ones that I've sort of signalled so far, might lead us to questions like, do marginalised people and groups require more intimacy capital to thrive? Does intimacy capital as a perceived good too easily dovetail with individual responsibilisation discourses and victim blaming, shaming when intimacy online goes wrong? And is the kind of intimacy capital gestured to by Lambert and others akin to the kind of heteronormative social reproduction in digital spaces that Kylie Jarrett has pointed towards something similar? Perhaps a more transformative politics of digital intimate publics might gesture towards an expanded ethics of care and kind of radical shamelessness in relation to public intimate traces, disclosures and performances for anybody who desires or needs such, towards cultures where intimacies and emotional styles of diverse kinds can be enacted publicly without shame or judgment. And such moves, I guess I'd like to suggest, might centrally involve considerations of or attention to more mobile processes of attachment, as Ballant puts it, and shifts in the regime of attention, as Larson and Hjorth put it. And I'd add maybe attention to intimacy glitches as well, to small mistakes or social missteps that might provoke us to question the boundaries of our care and pleasure. So perhaps it's when people get normative intimacy as it's kind of emerging on social media wrong, that nascent possibilities and generative spaces are opened up for questioning the underlying values of such. So I suggest in short the importance of making space in debates about oversharing and social media excesses to critically question what counts as normative intimacy and what does not. Social media, as I've mentioned, are spaces of interaction where social contexts are quite radically collapsed and flattened. And context collapse, as Boyd and Myrick have outlined, has become, a kind of involuntary precondition of participation, or at least is only partially conscious, controlled and consensual. And this now normative context collapse of social media does not mean the loss of all hierarchy in personal relationships, and it doesn't mean the loss of all contextual meaning in the ways in which people share and interpret the shared and exposed data of those around them. But it does perhaps warrant an expanded ethics of queer camaraderie and generosity, as Warner puts it, and potentially new digital intimacy practices and modulations that cross heteronormative boundaries of intimates and non-intimates and may transgress these emergent intimacy norms that I'm trying to know. So, how am I going for time? What's the time?
Great.
Good. Okay. That's good. I'm nearly done. I'll only talk quickly about the kind of other side of this, digital intimacy as labour, because it's less of my focus, I suppose. But to signal what we're trying to get at in this section, I'll start with Terranova, whose concept of free labour offers a critical early intervention in debates about the appropriation of the effective labour of social reproduction in the digital economy. So she identified the role of voluntary unpaid contributions of internet users, summarised by Jarrett here, demonstrating how their social capacities shaped the emerging digital media platforms. So crucially, their activity was free in the double sense, both freely given and unpaid, simultaneously enjoyed and exploited. So Andrejević goes on then to argue that free labour, even though it may be chosen, pleasurable and socially and politically meaningful, is simultaneously still exploited. He argues the mere fact someone benefits from the efforts of another does not in itself constitute exploitation, and suggests that we consider instead exploitation as a situation characterised by a loss of control over one's productive and creative activities. So thus, it's possible to argue that the mere fact digital intimate publics double as data that feed the commercial model of advertiser-funded social media platforms does not undermine their political valence, the political valence of their publicness. However, it's over time, the existence of digital intimate publics on primarily commercial platforms becomes exploitative in the sense that these publics congeal into the material form of the platform. So when we enact intimacy through private social media platforms, I guess the important thing to point out is that we're rendering our intimate relations not just visible to, but owned by private platforms. So when we use a platform for years and years, we contribute to the gradual training of the platform architecture. And then, as we know, we might decide to delete our account and all of our data that goes with it, but what we can't recover are the contributions that we make to the engineering of the platform itself, its algorithmic capacity to shape and reproduce social relations, and that is to make judgments about people like us and our affective capacities. So digital intimacy involves reproducing social relations as data and transcribing social relations into databases. So an issue for further consideration that we try to go into a bit more, and I don't have time for, is that through such training, platforms learn to identify and maintain boundaries between different kinds of people and boundaries between different kinds of intimate relations. Users train platforms to reproduce and reinforce their practices of giving and gaining attention. And so our public intimacy builds the interfaces, protocols and algorithms of privately owned platforms, and with that the capacity of media to calculate and shape intimate relations. And of course the political stakes of this are most acute for those already marginalised, a long-standing axes of social inequality. So here then I think that current prominent debates about privacy, either individual responsibility for protecting one's private data or sort of the privacy rights for individual users, still divert us from the bigger picture, that social media are historically significant not just for the way they kind of invade our privacy by accumulating personal information, but also because of the way they digitally enclose and erode the public commons, as many people have written about, but we're going to Andreevich there. So to examine the politics of digital intimate publics more fully, then we need to account for their productiveness within a capitalist digital media economy. And they need to be understood as part of larger historical shifts towards the rendering of intimate life, emotions, care and social relations into private capital. And Kylie Jarrett's made this argument quite powerfully in The Digital Housewife. So that digital intimacy can function as productive labour must be understood as the outcome of a social and historical process through which the work of social reproduction that's unevenly distributed and rewarded in the first place is incorporated into the business models of social media. And I don't have time today, but what Nick goes into in this section of the paper is to try and outline some of the qualities of intimate publics that make them particularly productive in digital capitalism in terms of providing labour by the very kind of excesses that I've tried to signal. So, you know, there are some really important contradictions and paradoxes here in the politics of digital intimate publics that we're trying to get at. So he discusses how and why platforms allow for excessive and transgressive intimacies because they can control at the level of modulation and who gets to see who, and the digitisation of social reproduction and the training of algorithms specifically. And I'm not going to go into any of that. I'm going to get to the conclusion now. Which is that, in very brief, what we've tried to do, just hang on, is, you know, in our discussion of both the social capital and the labour involved in digital intimate publics is that it's unevenly distributed, and so it follows are the potential rewards, affordances, harms and exploitations. But, and I guess this is the key point for me, what is called for in response to the potential for inequality and exploitation when digital intimacy is understood as social capital and as labour is not a moralist reboxing of intimacies into the private domain, into a private domestic domain. This is neither possible nor desirable. Following Bellant and Warner, and following Kathy Weeks, who we engage with more in the labour section, the desire to relegate intimacy to the private relies on a false conceptualisation of such spheres as separate and somehow purer or less estranged places for intimate and social relations than the public domains of work, consumption and media. Rather, we suggest what is called for is to heed the lessons of queer and feminist theory that the most intimate of feelings and relations and the effective care and work that surrounds them has always been central to both waged labour under capitalism and to the social reproduction that sustains it. We've argued towards a politics of publicness then on two fronts. So first, there's the politics that I tried to gesture towards of paying attention to the public digital inscription of unpredictable relations, attachments, feelings and expressions of care that don't fit the mould of heteronormative social reproduction and that potentially build queerer, more public, intimate worlds. And second, of course, there's the need for the fundamental need for a politics that prioritises shared control over the material technologies of intimacy, for platform architectures that are built not just to capitalise privately on new forms of expression, social and intimate relations, but to enable shared public ownership of such relations as manifest in the digital. So further attention to the political stakes of the publicness of relations and infrastructures of digital intimacy is required. And the problem, as we've tried to articulate it here, is not that social media has somehow made intimate life too public, but rather that intimate life on social media is not public enough.